Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first episode of the first season of This, That, and the Other. My name is Varun Chandramohan, your host for today. Seated right next to me is my lovely co host for today, Numika. Hey, Numika.
Hi.
Okay, hope you got a good dose of coffee because we're going to need it. I have mine because This, That, and the Other is a series unlike anything you've seen before. Over the next 10 weeks, we'll be talking about 10 topics with 26 guests. And what we hope to do is to tackle some of the biggest, most controversial challenges HR and senior managers face within an organization. This is not a panel discussion. It's not an interview. It's not a webinar. It's part talk show, part talk radio, part podcast. So, what is this, that, and the other about? Do let us know when you find out. Our conversation today will be about affairs at work, the good, the bad, and the ugly. It doesn't get more controversial than this. We will be talking about things that would get people fired. That's the kind of stuff that we will be going over today. But this conversation has to be had. With that said, it's time to introduce our guest. He is a product of the Faculty of Engineering from the University of Moratuwa and is currently the head of shared services human resources at IT360, an Expo Lanka company. Venuje Veerasekara is here with us today. Hello, Venuje.
Hi, Arun. Hi, everyone.
All right, she's truly a transnational individual, having studied in Canada and England and having worked in 3 countries. She's currently the head of human resources at the Jumaya Group in Kenya. Tuvi Vijayanathan Kulkarni is here with us today. Hello, Tuvi.
Hi, nice to be with you guys.
I'm pretty sure I messed up your last name. Apologies for that. It happens all the
My
time.
husband's name, so it's all good. My name was good.
Clarifying that. All right, so let's dive straight in. With today's topic, can we begin by defining what an affair is? Um, we can stick to textbook stuff, but if you ask my mom, anyone who has ever gone out, anyone who has ever been in a relationship, she'll be like they had an affair, which I'm pretty sure is not the definition. How would you define what an affair is, and obviously from an organizational context? Uh, Venuja, to be okay. Let me flip a coin. Who wants to go first? Venuja, you want to take a step at the
Okay, sure,
yeah.
sure. So, Arun, now let's take this down in the organizational context. So, what do you really mean by an affair in the organization context? Like when you hear the word affair, so the word itself, even if you take the whatever the dictionary definition, it's goes to the other side. So it says uh, so let me make it easy. So I'll straight away take whatever the definition,
Sure.
right? So it says romantic and sexual relationship between two people who are not married to each other. So though it's the dictionary definition, so I would not really classify into people who are not married to each other. Uh, so maybe there can be affairs. This is a very complex topic. There can be affairs between
Sure.
not non-married people, maybe married. So it would
Yeah.
definitely go beyond the definition what is in the dictionary. So let's find it out during our conversation.
Fair enough. Let's do that. Tuvi, do you have a take on that?
So what's very funny is when Ujar and me first spoke, we were talking about the definition of affair in like a Sri Lankan context, right?
Sure.
And my Sinhalese is not very good. Neither is
Right.
my Tamil, to be very fair. But I remember when I used to work there used to be this always like, there was always something around the hush hush conversations around, oh my God, like, affair kaktibba or affair kakti and all, right? And I mean, that is exactly like, what it is to me actually. So when you say affairs at work, for me, it's like, it's not bound to like, people being married to each other. They could even be married to different people, but there is something going on romantically or sexually or perhaps both.
Sure. So let's
And Varun, you're really going to,
Yeah.
you're putting me in the spot where like, I actually am at risk of like being fired now. Like, I'm getting very
All right.
controversial
So,
things
so,
right
so
at get-go.
just to clear the air, so for the audience, for the viewers out there, so we will be discussing level 5 classified stories and things like all for the benefit of our audience to know,
No, of course.
what to look for. And obviously, like if you find yourself in a situation like that, what do you do? And also from an organization point of view, like how would you tackle something like this? And in the future, if you are going to come up with a framework, to kind of oversee this, of course, that's something that we should talk about later on. How would you go about doing that? And that's the whole conversation. So let's start with. Do you think relationships, so we'll use the word relationships. Do you think relationships are something that should be encouraged at the workplace, or should they be, how would you view that? I mean, you are in HR, both are guests. How would you view that? If the moment you hear someone, okay, there are two people in a relationship, is it positive, negative, or does a whole bunch of stuff just rush to your head? What's your first thought?
Yeah, Varun. So what I have realized during my tenure as a chairperson, so you really can't stop affairs at work. So as we all know, we all are human. So something like no dating policy, trust me, it's not going to work. So affairs are not bad.
Sure, love conquers
So
all, right? Yeah.
yeah. So what is bad or what makes the organization suffer is the unwanted consequences that might arise, being affair being the case. So I would rather say affairs are not bad, but it is how you manage it and how you made it clear for your employees. So that's our responsibility as HR people.
Fair enough. Do you have
Yes, I think, I
anything to
mean,
add?
I think I actually agree with Venager, because I think it's very difficult to like put a framework in place that is non-restrictive, because more often than not people will go against it, especially when you're looking at millennials and Gen Z. What I think is actually advisable is possibly having a basic governance structure just to govern the risks around. I know what I'm saying sounds quite theoretic, but I think it's important to understand, how then do you, conduct yourself without breaching any code of conduct? How do you manage things like conflict of interest? And then in the event something goes wrong and there is a risk of bullying and harassment, either from the person you were going out with or from bystanders, I think that is essentially where we can set a governance framework which is not too binding. Because I think recently we launched a policy as well where we asked people to disclose, especially if there was unequal power in relationship by virtue of one person being senior to the other person, just
Yeah.
to make sure that they were protected. But I think some feedback around that is actually people are not going to be comfortable to disclose. So I think it's still something that is quite debatable, and because it has feelings and emotions involved as opposed to mere fact, it becomes very difficult to put a framework around it. But
Sure.
yeah, that's my view for now.
Sure, Timothy. Thanks for that. So let's try and break this down, and let's try and break this conversation down, and let's take a look at it from an individual point of view, and then we'll kind of go up the hierarchy there. So Numika has an interesting question for you.
So, what if you are the person? What if you have fallen in love with somebody, and how do you manage that situation?
So from an individual's perspective, you saw someone, violence in the background.
Should you bring it out, or should you talk to HR, or keep it yourself?
So Nemika, you should be asking this in the organizational context, right? So I'm going to answer it.
No, I
keeping
mean,
that in mind.
you can you can let us know from a employee perspective. So if you are an employee in this situation, even when you like someone, and obviously no two stories are the same, but it involves a certain amount of courting and then eventually asking the person out. And just for this particular question, let's assume the other person says yes and things go according to plan. What would so what you from an individual perspective, what should you kind of be ready for, or should you tell HR first, or should you keep it under wraps? Should you look at your company policy? Should you what's your what is your advice for an employee from an employee's perspective?
Good. So Nimka, like when you have a situation like this, the first thing, there can be two cases. So first, you need to clarify either that person is married or that person is not married, right? So if that person
That
is
is
not
so
married,
spot on, Venuja. You're just putting words into my mouth right now because I was just trying to figure out how I was going to say that.
What
so
if we
okay,
take
Thank you.
like a
Elephant in the
let me
room is
explain.
out. Okay.
Sure.
So,
Okay.
so I'm not married, right? So
yeah
I
in
have
your
this kind of
context,
feeling
being a
or
single
attraction.
person.
Okay. For this particular person, say fellow coworker, right?
Right.
So again, I tend to break things because due to my engineering background, I always try to see like what permutation and combinations, maybe two sets. So I would break this scenario. So there can be two scenarios: an affair between two unmarried people. The other side is affair between either one married person or one non-married person, or both being unmarried, right? So both of the latter cases falls into one, because even at least if one is married, then it's a problem. So let's take the easiest.
I love how this is like one of those questions you get online, on social media, like if this happens and if A happens and if B, it's lovely. Continue.
Okay. So let's take the scenario one. So both employees are unmarried. Again, if you see their levels in the company. So now two colleagues, like, so I have my fellow coworker who is really working with me on day-to-day basis, having some feelings with her, as you heard. Yeah. So that's I would say that's the most least damaging, maybe, or uh, least one. So imagine a scenario like where, yeah. So imagine I am being a female and say my boss is a male. So that's a more difficult thing to manage, like affair between a boss and a subordinate. So I would say now it all depends on how the company policies are now written. So if you take an example, there are certain companies, it is in black and white. So when you are joining, the employee handbook says, now if you have an affair, so either you can't be in both of you can't be in one department. So especially if you take like maybe financial institute, but they says, if you have an affair with anyone of in your branch, so you can't continue. So either one of you have to get transferred to a different branch. So likewise, if it is very clear on the policies of the company, so actually it makes my life easier, because I know where and when to escalate, right? So basically, I should escalate this to my immediate supervisor or HR manager before things are public, right? So so that's my view. So again, taking the second part, the affair between a married and an unmarried person. Again, it's a complex thing. So in HR context, like the company, I mean, my view. So we are really not interested in what goes on in your personal life, as long as it doesn't cross that border, and as long as it doesn't really affect the work. So as HR manager, but again, it's up to you to decide like why you are in that kind of a situation, and to analyze what you really need. So we'll come to that part in later part, the psychology behind having an work affair. So I'll leave it to Tuvi for the comments.
Right. Tuvi, anything to add?
I think, I mean, if I was not HR, right, and I was like sitting on the other side of the fence, I think it's actually very difficult, even though it is possibly governed in a policy. Can you hear me, guys? You can hear me, right? I'm assuming. Yeah.
Yeah,
So I
yeah,
think,
louder.
I mean, it's very difficult if you're like on the other side of the coin. You're expected to, I mean, disclose. I think it's actually extremely tough to have that conversation with HR because more often than not, HR comes across as the moral police. Yesterday I had to call someone, like, I mean, for like something good, and they were so scared that the head of HR was calling them, and I kept asking, am I that scary? I'm not scary. But they're like, no, HR, right? At the end of the day, there's the HR tag attached to it.
Right.
So
Yeah.
I think as much as it is dictated in policy, it's very difficult. I think more often than not, people might tend to tell their line managers before they actually approach HR. So I think, I mean, there are two ways you could do it, right? Like if you're in a situation where there are no strings attached or nothing that could create any social dilemma, I think it's very easy to either have that conversation with your line manager or with HR. But I think it's also the responsibility of line managers to help their teams to have, like, you know, upward feedback discussions. I think line managers should also not necessarily be like, you know, constantly passing moral judgments around, like, you know, what their teams are doing. And likewise for HR, I think an example of bad HR practice is where HR thinks that they are, like, you know, they're the moral compass of the organization, and that if two
Right.
people are, for example, married to each other and, like, you know, decide to go out, like, you know, they have a say in governance when it's actually those people's personal lives. So I think the dilemma arises then when, for example, it's not a typical relationship that you can disclose. And I think that is where more often than not, I think most people will not talk about it, especially because of the social stigma attached to it. And the minute that you even speak to a manager, one person, like, you know, gets to know, it's a cat out of the bag situation. So I think, I mean, it's very difficult really, because if I'm an individual, I mean, I can make a personal choice who I fall in love with, right? But then
Yeah,
sometimes love just happens and you fall in love. So
for
it's
sure.
actually quite difficult really if I
Yeah,
was on, like, you know, not on the HR side of things.
yeah, yeah, for sure. So, hmm. I have two questions to. I'm trying to figure out which one to ask first. When do you tell your organization? Like, is there such a time? Do you have like a, yeah, now's a good time. Say it before it, you know, gets any further. Do
Uh,
you have that? And feel free to jump in, and on that note, just a sidestep. We have viewers who are watching this. If you have any questions, if you have any specific scenarios that you are currently facing or likely to face, and if you want to hear our guests, their thoughts on how to navigate them, please feel free to drop us a message. Do drop us your questions, and we'll bring them up. Uh, Go ahead, Venetia.
yeah, now Varun, along with what we mentioned, so
Yeah.
it is something like extramartial. So most
Mhm.
likely the employee would not escalate, right? So if it is
Right.
something genuine, like you really want to get married to that person or something, with that spirit, you will escalate it to HR or your line manager. It's a
Right.
simple answer, like you should escalate it before anyone in your team let you manage it. Simple as that.
Sure.
So it's like this. So say now we have a coworker, like you tend to stare at her, like not doing work, so maybe 15 minutes, 30 minutes. So that's
Right.
something that the people who around you, like, they really notice it.
Sure.
All right. So if you guys hang out too much time, you guys spend too much time maybe in the lunchroom or maybe the rest areas. So
Oh,
it's
interesting. Yeah, I was about to ask that.
obvious
Okay.
case,
Yeah.
like the other people have all evidence to notice something. Yeah. So before anyone informs your manager, you better inform your manager.
Yeah, before tongues start wagging, I suppose.
Uh-huh. All right. Okay.
I think, I mean, there are two ways to look at it, right? One way would be like, you know, from the whole tongues wagging perspective, right? Because I think sometimes in cultures that are highly high context or socialist, people are always looking out for each other.
Sure.
Perhaps, like, you know, it may be in a good way or in a bad way, but then people notice. And I think the other one is when you're in a position to formalize it, right? Yeah, when you're in a position to formalize it. So I think, I mean, when you decide, okay, I think this is going somewhere, because right now, I think, I mean, maybe possibly 20 years ago, like, you know, you fall in love with someone, you are compelled to marry that person, but now people do have the autonomy of choices. So I think if you're ready to formalize, or even if you're like, you know, married, or one party is married, but you're deciding to take a more firm step in terms of what you want to do with that relationship, and you need to, like, you know, make a call into your existing formal relationship, I think, I mean, then you will possibly need company support. But it also depends on how conducive the conditions are in your company. Huh?
Oh, absolutely.
Because, for example, I think that is why it has to be like a two-way thing. It cannot just be like, okay, I'm an employee, I'm obligated, but if I go to Tuvi and Tuvi is going to be like, oh my goodness, like,
Sure.
you know, I have a problem with the fact that this person is dating a married person, he's not a good role model. I mean, if I'm going to talk like that, then obviously you're not going to come and talk to me, right? So you sweep it at the cup, but I will not know, and then things will,
Sure.
like, you know, possibly end up for worse. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's interesting that you bring that up, because it completely depends on the organizations. The few organizations that I've come across, they do have a not something written, but like a soft policy to, you know, let us know, so that when we think about promotions, think about, you know, sort of assigning new teams and things like that, so they can have that at the back of their mind. And I'm talking about progressive companies, so just to ensure that they don't end up being supervisor to each other, or something like that. And of
Exactly.
course, that
The
brings a
Chinese
whole,
wall paradigm, right? That's exactly
yeah.
what they want to break. So,
Yeah, and we'll get into the whole complexities when that happens, and when somebody gets promoted, or when somebody has to supervise each other. We'll get to that. But before that, where do we, or rather, where do we draw the line between privacy and sort of giving them the personal space, right? Like, where do we draw the line, and how do we say, okay, lunch together is fine, but is holding hands okay in office? Probably not. But where do we draw the line? Because we've seen, right, like in organizations where you know, when at a event, at a company event, those who are going out are together. They're not mingling around with the rest, and then that becomes now a little bit of an employee engagement issue. So where do we draw the line, or can we draw the line between personal space and privacy?
To answer that question, Varun, it is very difficult to draw the line. So what we can tell is, we can tell the employees, you better draw your own lines, and
Sure. Okay. Yeah. Just draw your own.
we can say now, as I said, we can't stop this. Rather, we can tell, we can emphasize them when we are onboarding, at handbooks, or at induction. So you can do whatever you want, as long as you don't feel
Sure.
that other people around you, something like that. It should be a very common sense thing, because policies and practices from company to company differs. So so let me take an example. So what is applicable behavior in a like European context, or like Western culture, that might not be applicable in a like Sri Lankan, or like some Asian culture. So you need to have that awareness, like maybe holding hands during your lunchtime should be applicable maybe in a European country, and whereas it might not be applicable in Sri Lankan country. So it all depends on your company culture, the subculture around it, the norms, the beliefs that people have. So you should have that understanding where to draw the line.
Ruby, anything to add?
No, I think, I mean, it's around, I think about 1.5 years ago, I think I was talking to a girl who went through a pretty bad breakup. And I think she asked me, like, you know, I mean, she didn't realize that she could have reached out to me, like, you know, for personal advice, right? And I told her whatever I was telling her was personally, I mean, it was coming from a very personal side, right? It wasn't coming from a professional side. And I told her, like, I have no right to pass moral judgment on you while you're at the office, as long as you're not like, behaving inappropriately within the office space. So, I mean, when it comes to like, I mean, I think it's fine. And I think in my current organization as well, we do have people who are going out with each other. But I mean, as long as there's no illicit behavior, like, people are not having any physical engagement in like, within the workplace, or like, the washrooms or the car park where people would be then seen to. Nuvika, I know it's funny, but it does happen, right? Like that is the truth, right? So I think it's just around the fact that wherever you could be identified as an employee of this organization, you need to put your best judgment forward, because at the end of the day, not only are you compromising yourself as an employee, but also the employer's brand.
Sure.
Yeah.
But I think at the same time, as long as you're applying that discretion, because what you do as soon as you leave the office, right, is none of my business, right? So whatever you're doing really does not matter, but just exercise professional etiquette while you're there. And I think actually, if you think about professional etiquette, it's largely globalized. It has a largely international perspective. So I think, how you're expected to behave during lunch, I think, regardless of where you may be sitting, I think, regardless of whether you're sitting in Kenya, in Sri Lanka, or possibly in London, you wouldn't necessarily be holding your girlfriend's hand while having lunch. I think that would be highly inappropriate.
Yeah.
So I think, that's something I think should be like good governance, but then it's also on like, the employer to train employees, right? So like Venuja was saying, during induction, right? I mean, you might think that, you don't need to educate people on these topics, but you do.
Yeah.
But you
yeah.
do.
Sure.
I mean, ironically, this is slightly wavering from the topic, but I remember like, especially in Kenya, like, we have a very, how would I say, a very culture whereby people like to hug, people like to touch each other, regardless of whether you're dating or whether you're not, right? And I remember someone coming up to me and saying that, oh, you know what, this actually makes me a little uncomfortable. So for me, it really wasn't a big deal because it was part and parcel of like, what the culture entailed. But then I think it's also about educating people around, guys, we understand this is how you behave, but if someone says that they're uncomfortable with it, hear them out. Because that is possibly coming from their own, like, cultural background, which is fine. It's their personal choice. And if they express that, I think, it's only fair to like abide by it. So yeah, that's my take on this.
So let's for those of you who are joining us, we are in conversation with Tuvi and Venuja, and we're talking about affairs at work, the good, the bad, and the ugly. We just touched on from an employee's point of view, what to expect, or rather what would be the best practices. If you do get into a relationship, when do you inform the organization, and so on. And on that note, we did talk about a variety of different combinations of how these relationships can occur. Now, there are three things that I would like to bring up. One was, just following up from what Tuvi said, what they do in their personal space is truly, their business, especially if they're adults and two consenting adults, it's completely fine. Now, what happens when there's a breakup? We've all had that friend who've gone out forever, especially if you've been a part of a company for a long time and they've gone out and all of a sudden, they're in high positions, but then the relationship breaks off.
Yeah.
Awkwardness sets in. And truly, sometimes there are some couples when they break off, they're still professional, all that. But then sometimes it can get quite awkward. So that's one aspect that I just want to put forward, and then just touch on the topic of when bosses start to have affairs. How have you, in your past experience of let's not name companies or names or anything like that, how would you tackle that? Because from an employee's perspective, that must be quite damaging, right? It must be quite awkward.
The awkwardness, of course, something that I've experienced, but
yeah. So
but
Yeah, exactly. Like how would you do that? Like especially because now you have questions of favoration and all of those things start to come in. And it makes it even worse when both parties or even one of those parties are married or is in an existing relationship and whatnot. Any thoughts on that when
This awkwardness happens when your
yeah, how
boss
do
or somebody
you
superior to you are having.
yes. So how do you handle that? How do you we'll talk about two perspectives, from an employee's perspective and from an HR perspective. How do you tackle something like that? And I know there are two questions hidden in there. One is when you break off and all of a sudden after breaking off you're two separate individuals in a high position, and when bosses have affairs.
Okay, Varun. So we should analyze like when it's a breakup, like
Right.
so the impact for the company. So actually now the earlier days we could tell keep everything out of your office hours, and what happens outside your office hours it's not our business. So if you really see the current context, maybe your work is not right limited to 8 to 5 work hours. If you take like work from home policy kind of a thing, uh, so you really can't draw that line also now. You can't say these are the office hours. So you can't say these are the non-office hours. So what we can uh, measure, what we can stress is on the deliverables. Like, are you delivering what is expected from your job role? So anything related to your whatever the breakup or affair, does that affect your deliverables? Or it's happened like this. So is that drama, I would say. So it's in a breakup. So
Yeah.
is that affecting the fellow co-workers? Like, are they disturbed in an unnecessary way? So all of them suddenly maybe start their own work and they may having chats on this particular scenario. So that's
For
very
sure. Yeah.
disturbing in an organization context. And the precedence we are setting, say now in this kind of a situation. So we should really see now, so are we setting the right precedence in kind of a thing, especially when it comes to the bosses having an affair? Say now I'm having an affair in someone in my subordinates. Say now I have another three more subordinates in the same category. So how can I give instruction, or how can I manage the other subordinates? So they would definitely lose the respect they have in me. So they can always tell, this person is like that. So it causes a huge challenge there, having control and having the team together, and it waves hand for a lot of unnecessary problems. So that's my view on that.
All right, Tuvi, I'm sure you have quite a lot of insight, to
Yeah,
share.
so I think on like employee breakups, right? I think there are two ways we look at it. So one is on the whole um, psychological well-being of that employee per se. So I think when you talked about like their deliverables, right? And I think, I mean that a breakup in some form or the other does come with its psychological burden, right? It can be quite traumatic. And I think in the recent past, so like my organization is quite early stage, right? So we are still able to like test out a lot of policies. And I think one thing that we have realized is if somebody is going through something that is creating like an emotional impact on their work, we are happy to give them like some time off using, of course, like, the usual leave policy, because we think that's a healthy way to let them cope and come back, and then they have their productivity in check. And I think it's important that companies do understand, like, how emotional well-being does have a very strong correlation on productivity, and and making sure that they're able to thrive. I think the second piece is around the gossip and the stigma attached to a breakup, right? So
Oh,
as much
absolutely.
as you may be fine, but if you are like, being constantly gossiped about, or I mean, I remember like, women sometimes could be called outrageous names, right? And I'm sure that is the same for guys as well, right? And then there are their own their own like stories and concussions around why these people broke up, or why, like, this happened. And I think that is something that, like, companies should be not tolerant about, because I think gossip is a form of bullying, and that is extremely like damaging. So I think, like I said, right, from get-go, it's a two-way street. The company also needs to have some form of no tolerance policy on this type of thing. I think I have personally spoken to people who have talked about this with me, where they have talked to me about how they feel that people are still gossiping about them. And I have like very vehemently said that, I will very firmly have a chat about anyone who's spreading a rumor, because not only is it damaging them, it's also damaging their own, reputational risks, right? So I think that's important. On the boss piece, I think as long as there's no conflict of interest, it really should not matter. It can be awkward, but I think it also depends on, a boss or someone who becomes a line manager, right? I think becoming a line manager is not something people should be taking for granted. So the minute you do, there is an additional layer of responsibility, which sometimes can become a burden, but exercising discretion. So for example, let's say I have three members in my team, and I am dating one of them. We need to make a vehement call about switching that person, right? So either I change to a different team, which is sad because I possibly worked hard to get to where I am, or we switch the other person. So, and I think it's also then taking a call between your personal and professional side, right? It's not easy, but I think that's essentially how it should be approached.
Thank you. That's very, 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 very true. So Numika, you came across an interesting article, right, recently?
Yes. So basically, what I read was apparently after 2005 until 2030, there had been more and more policies coming up for these kind of affairs at work, right? So there's two sides of the things. The reason why they're doing it is because there's a lot of sexual harassment cases coming towards the company, as well as the person involved in is also being sued. So the company has to bear two costs. So that's a big cost that the companies have to face. So because of that, going with policy seems to be like the best. So what do you think about having policies with regard to this area?
That's quite interesting. I think the industry term for that is love contracts. Like you have should companies have put down something? That's an actual term, by the way.
Yes,
I didn't come up with it.
So love contract is basically if you claim that you're having an affair, then you have to sign one, something like that.
Right, and then it lists the.
Yeah. So if they break up, then they're on contract with something like that.
Okay. So have you? Or do you recommend that? Is it a good practice, bad practice? Should organizations look into that?
So Nimika and Varun, so in my view, this is a must-have in a company. So in the context of rather avoiding problems, rather trying to solve them after they arise. So it is always take preventive action rather than taking corrective action. So what you really need to do is not to have a no dating policy kind of a thing, but to have some kind of a guideline, a general guideline, and make sure that every one of your employees are being aware of that. So they can't say, you didn't tell me, I don't know, this kind of thing. You should have told me before.
They will still say, I don't know, Venuja. You know that. They will still say, I don't know, because they possibly didn't read the handbook. But yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, like most
so
of
best thing is to present it, present it in the induction and take their signatures. So rather we do conduct induction via Microsoft Teams also. So always you have the recording, so you can't say no. So it's a crucial, like you need to tell where to draw the line, where to escalate. So again, there are two things. So the escalation would be the genuine affairs, rather the legal affairs in the context. And as we said, like if you really want to consider your current relationship and again come up something new after closing that, it's your thing to manage. But again, yeah, so we have to specify which one needs to be highlighted to the management, so rather to HR. And we can tell like you can't have relationship, maybe boss and subordinate relationship if they are in the same department. So as a consequence, maybe you either yourself or your other party has to get transferred to different location or a department. So they know. So what if I do this? What will happen? What if I do this? What will happen? So there are a lot of cases like I came through, even some of my personal friends. So maybe they find their soulmate in that company, but as a result, they thought to one person shifting to a different company. So they take that conscious decision rather than waiting till the last moment. So they know that the company policy is this. So either myself or my other party have to find some alternate location. And of course, like the best part in these affairs, like is that you tend to know that person better when you work in like you are in a work context. So organizations should be totally fine if one person can find a reliable partner or a like the sole partner in the company. So we shouldn't be interfering that line. So as long as it doesn't affect the company, so it's a good thing to have as long as it doesn't affect the company performance. So a policy is must. So
Yeah. No, I broadly agree with you. No, I think, I mean, we've evolved a lot, right? Because I think my parents, they met at HSBC where I actually started out. And I think at that point it was like, you know, no dating. One of the two had to move.
Sure.
And I think like it actually became more beneficial because I think my dad moved and then he was able to progress and my mom stayed on. And I think, I mean, at that point it was the norm. Huh? This is like, you know, nearly 20 odd years ago. But I think since then, having something that is very restrictive is extremely, extremely difficult, right? I think my husband and me were joking about like, you know, how in his old company, like there used to be a no dating policy and people would vehemently date, himself included. Huh?
Right.
So what they would do is like, you know, after a workshop, they would like, you know, sneak out to like, you know, because I mean, at that point in time, when you're like in your early 20s, right? I mean, you're raring to go and obviously like, you know, you want to break all the rules, right? We've all been there, done that. So I think, I mean, that's actually highly restrictive. So I think having like a baseline around like, you know, how this needs to be governed, how it shouldn't be interfering with your work. I know that, for example, let's say like in insurance or in the financial sector where there is broad conflict of interest on the risk of Chinese walls, you have to have a governance. So let's say like, you know, I'm in HR and we're a public listed company and my husband's working in finance, then I mean, we need to disclose. And then I think they would even observe the activity on like, you know, our own staff purchase of shares before like, you know, the closing period happens, just to make sure that, you know, there isn't any risk. So I think having like, you know, just a broad set of guidelines in terms of governance is good. And I think it should be a no harm approach. So like I said, no moral judgment should be inflicted, right? At the end of the day, you are consulting adults, as you said previously. But at the end of the day, just understanding the elements of risk around it and what could go wrong while you are in a relationship, what could go wrong after you're in a relationship. And then also having something around the bystander policy, right? Because I think in high context cultures, it's very, very important. So, I mean, how, for example, you're not expected to be gossiping about two people. I think it's very hard to enforce because it actually, like, you know, stems back from, like, you know, cultural norms as well. But I think that's something that, you know, to definitely keep in mind when you're building a policy around such controversial topics, if I may say.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And this is quite interesting because we are getting a lot of questions in the lines of, you know, they're having, I mean, the chances of having a conflict of interest whenever a relationship forms in an organization, even if it's an affair. And yes, there's a conflict of interest, but on the other side, there is a right to like whoever we want to, and there's a right to point it out. So there is that nice balance, and I'm glad that you know that you're addressing the how do you not limit, but how do you kind of set some guidelines? What comes to my mind is a friend of mine who uh, know somebody who works at Netflix was saying that they have this interesting mantra saying always act in the best interest of Netflix, and I think in from a company standpoint, there is a lot of gray area. It sometimes might be difficult to put down things on paper and say do this, this is the right way, wrong way. But when you say something like act in the best interest of a company, that does cover quite a large area, especially when we come across examples of two individuals going out and all of a sudden one person gets promoted, or a senior manager getting into a relationship with somebody much more junior, and now we have confidentiality issues, right? Like from salary information to just like you said, in a public limited company, that can have detrimental effects, especially if somebody has a heads up on shares being bought and yeah, insider trading it could be a reality in that case. So I absolutely get that, and Numika agrees as well. So can I ask, as guests being in two different countries, can you be fired for being in a relationship at office? Like, is that possible? Apart from, I'm talking apart from gross misconduct, like apart from incidents that are not acceptable in any standard, but generally just having a relationship in any level. Okay.
No.
No, you can't. Yeah.
Not over here.
All right.
Not tied in Sri Lanka.
All right. So
that's good, then, Ujana. I can come back and work with you. Very progressive. But actually I have I think what you shared around always do goodbye Netflix, I think ties to a larger point around how employees will manage conflict of interest.
Sure.
Because I think the employee engagement piece is very important to bind the psychological contract between the employer and employee. So at the end of the day, right, if the company, I have felt that I have learned by the company has invested in me, whereby I have learned, I have grown, and I want to continue to learn and grow. You are very likely to have the company's best interests at heart. Absolutely. Very, very unlikely that you are going to do something that would compromise the company's best interests.
Sure.
And I think that is why employee engagement, doing things like stay interviews are extremely important, because it's largely tied to how the employer is making the employee feel. And I mean the same way, and then essentially that sort of binds the contract together, whereby the employee feels that they would be violating trust, they would be violating loyalty. And I think it comes back to something I've been saying the entire time around it being a two-way street.
Yeah, absolutely. Venuja, do you have anything to add to that?
All good in that aspect, Arun.
All right. So I think we're down to our last few minutes. I believe we have about 9 to 10 minutes left. So I would like to wrap this conversation up by talking about. Okay, let's talk about moving forward. Let's look ahead. There's obviously examples around the world of organizations managing relationships quite successfully, and Atuvi mentioned an example of her parents, and that's one. And I recently read that Bill Gates met his wife at Microsoft. She was a product manager, I think, if I'm not mistaken, and obviously again. He was a CEO, and obviously that changes the landscape a little bit. So, what can we, just as a wrap up, because there are people who are asking questions like, if there's a transfer or promotion in the card, should I disclose it? And that was something that we did address before, saying yes, absolutely. If you are going to expecting a promotion or a transfer, you have to disclose, because it could be a conflict of interest. So, just to kind of wrap up, let's talk about the organization side and the individual side. What can organizations do? Your top three tips for them to set them up for success in the future. What should they do to create an environment and if needed policies around. So what should they do in order to ensure that you don't violate anyone's personal right to like someone, fall in love with someone, and but at the same time protect the best interests of the company. So how can organizations approach it, like from top three tips, and then from an individual side, maybe three things they should keep in mind if you are in a relationship right now, or if you think you might be in a relationship in an organization with your peer or your subordinate. So we can start with Tuvi and then go to Benedict.
Sure. So I think, I mean, from an organizational standpoint, I think we talked about, like, you know, the macro picture, right? Whereby having policies, having a basic set of guidelines, a framework around is very important. But at the end of the day, I think all these guidelines and frameworks will do no good if managers are not able to have open discussions and encourage upward feedback from their employees. I think more often than not, whenever I've referred team members to the policies of the organization, I think they always tend to cite the fact that, oh, the line manager didn't encourage this conversation, or they didn't make them feel comfortable. I think there's a very, very famous saying about, like, you know, people don't leave companies, but people leave managers. And I think that holds true. And I think if anyone's watching, is a line manager at this point, I think understand that it is also in your best interest, and it only will help you grow if you're able to create that level of trust in your employee to be able to be transparent with you. I think that one is big, besides the guidelines that the organization would be enforcing, and of course to be educated around it, right? I think it's extremely important to, like, you know, reinforce the education, because trust me, I deal with this all the time. People say, no, we didn't read it. Oh, like, we couldn't find the module online. I'm like, okay, let me send it to you again. But I think if the line manager also, like, you know, endorses and pushes through the conversation, it makes HR's life very easy. So that is from the organization perspective. Employee perspective, I mean, as much as it's different to compartmentalize, I think your personal life should stay personal. So it is ultimately your personal choice who you decide to date, right? And you're not necessarily obligated to explain to the world why you're dating someone, regardless of whether you're married, they're married, or not, right? But I think what I would advise in a professional environment is make sure that you're not putting the organization at any risk. And at the minute you feel that, like, you know, the minute you feel that you're crossing a line, ideally there should be someone who you can trust within the organization, where you can clarify. And this is where the line manager paradigm holds very true, I think. Yeah, I think that would be how I would summarize it.
All right. Benajay, your thoughts from an organization point of view?
So I'm completely in agreement with what Tuvi says when it comes to organization context. So as she mentioned, the best thing is we need to have this open discussion, open culture. This is not something unusual. We all are human. Things can happen. So we need to create a culture that anyone can talk this openly, rather than like brushing it under the carpet. These issues, these concerns need to be openly talked with the line managers or companies. So having a clear company policy and make sure it is being communicated to people, it will help, and it will help to create a lot of issues before they arise. So I'm in complete agreement with that. And when it comes to people side, individual side, so if you are not married and again you get some kind of attraction or some liking to another unmarried person, that's totally fine. So what you need to decide is whether it doesn't affect the company policies. So then either you can decide whether you or she will be transferred to different company or something. So that's totally normal. The advice, the other thing that most people doesn't talk about, so I would like to touch upon that, this extramarital one. So what you really need to see is we might encounter, or we might find a colleague who encounter this in a day-to-day basis. You should really understand the psychology behind this. So if you really see the details, so in the first stage of an affair, like office affair, so you are not really attracted to that person. Rather, you are attracted to a perceived person or perceived image in your mind of that person. So you need to really find out so what lacks in your current relationship. Maybe the respect or the so what is lacking there, the value, right? So if you really analyze, you will notice. So that is something really not to do something with that person, but it is something that really need to do with yourself. So we get addicted to this feel good or like for the new wonderful self that that might create. So you need to be aware of that. So it's so our brain tricks us in this point, right? So when you are with that person, your brain releases good hormones, like so you become intoxicated to these hormones, right? So without your knowing, you will be carried away. So be mindful, understand the situation, and it's nothing new. Like we all are human, things can happen, but be mindful and do your best to not get into trouble. So that's my take-home advice.
Thank you, Venuji. That's nicely said. Unfortunately, I believe we are out of time, and with that, we'll have to bring to a close our first episode of the first season of This, That, and the Other. And we were talking about affairs at work, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Just like to take a moment to thank our guests, Tuvi and Venujay. Thank you so much for being with us here today. It's been a pleasure, and thank you for the insights, and thank you for the stories, and thank you for sharing your experiences. And a special thank you goes out to my co-host, Numika. Thank you so much. And to the Luminary team and to our audience who tuned in today and sent us a lot of questions and for your suggestions. Now, don't forget to tune in next week because we'll be talking to Bhanuka Harichandra, a board member and chief growth officer at Surge Global, and Kimansi Constable, the co-chief executive officer of Results Global Impact Consulting Agency in the US. And we'll be talking about side hustles and if they are okay to undertake when you're employed. A very, very interesting topic and a very timely topic. Side hustles when you're employed, and that's next Saturday at 3:30 p.m. Sri Lankan time. Until then, I'm Varun Chandra Mohan. Thank you for joining us today. See you next Saturday.